Well, let me welcome everybody to the second day of the August 2021 Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council meeting. We are going to be meeting jointly with both the Policy Board of ASMFC today and the Summer Flounder, Black Sea Bass, and Scup Board. And so there's going to be a lot of back and forth with the two different management bodies interacting together. But I want to thank all of you for being here today. As I said yesterday, it's a shame that we weren't able to be together in person, but that was a decision that we made a week ago. It was a tough decision to make, but I feel like it was the right thing at this time, given the status of the COVID-19 pandemic throughout the East Coast and throughout the country. So we will work through our agenda today as we did yesterday. We did a lot of specification settings for the four main species that we manage jointly. We're going to start today's meeting out with a presentation by Julia on the Recreational Harvest Control Rule Framework and Addendum. This is Framework Meeting 1, and I'm going to turn this over to Julia in just a second. This is the first time during these discussions that there's a suggestion by staff that we will need to not only provide direction for where staff is, what staff's working on for the harvest control rule, but we might need a motion. And so we're joined with the policy board at this point, and Pat Kelleher. Bob Beal is going to be chairing the meeting. Pat wasn't able to make it. Bob and I talked yesterday, and we decided that we would try to find consensus on moving forward because we don't really have any rules as to how the policy board and the council will engage in voting. That's something that we need to work on and talk about, this year before the end of the year. So Bob's going to be co-chairing the meeting. Bob, do you have anything you want to add before we get started?
No, thanks, Mike. Good morning. Nothing to add. I think your summary of the voting and consensus process is great. I just kind of echo your sentiment that I wish we were in Philly face to face, but it wasn't in the cards this time. But we're good at this virtual system. Right? Yeah. So thanks, Mike.
Yeah, and I appreciate you stepping in for Pat, who had other commitments that he wasn't able to make. So with that said, we'll just see how this presentation goes, and we have till 11 o'clock to decide on how we're going to move forward with this harvest control rule. So with that said, I'll stop talking because others can do it much more eloquently. I'm going to turn it over to Julia for the presentation on the Recreational Harvest Control Rule. Go ahead, Julia, whenever you're ready.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everybody. I think I had a little struggle with PowerPoint, but I think I have it resolved now. So if you ever see anything that's not a full slide, just let me know and I'll fix it. But I think I resolved the struggles I was having a second ago. Okay, so I'm going to start off the presentation, and then Savannah Lewis, who's the commission staff lead for this effort, will cover the second half of the presentation. And this presentation focuses...
Yeah, Julie, before you go, I'm sorry, Savannah. Yeah, thanks. I should have mentioned that you're part of this as well. So I know Julia was going to start, but thanks, Julia, for bringing that up.
No worries. So this presentation and this agenda item focuses on one aspect of the bigger recreational reform initiative. So the recreational reform initiative considers a number of different changes to recreational fisheries management for the 4 jointly managed recreational species. But right now we're focused just on the harvest control rule, which the Council and Policy Board directed staff to work on before the other recreational reform initiative topics. So this slide shows the outline of the presentation for today. So first, I'll remind you of the goal of the harvest control rule, and then Savannah and I will divide up presenting the FMAT and PDT's recommendations for draft alternatives to be further developed through a framework and addendum. And we'll describe each of them in more detail, so I won't read them all out loud now, but there's 5 of them, and we'll walk through each of them. And then Savannah will talk about our potential next steps for further development of this action. And then the goal is at the end to have a discussion so the Council and Policy Board can provide feedback and guidance on further development of these alternatives. So first, what's the goal of the harvest control rule? Well, the harvest control rule aims to set the recreational bag size and season limits for these species in a way that relies less on comparison of an MRIP estimate to recreational harvest limit or annual catch limit, and instead uses a more holistic approach with greater emphasis on stock status indicators and trends. And a thing that each of the alternatives have in common is that they all include some sort of predetermined management response to a suite of metrics. And the details vary by alternative in terms of what does that predetermined response look like and what are the specific metrics that are used, but we'll describe each of that in detail in later slides. So before we get into each of the individual alternatives, we wanted to first highlight some things that are the same across all of the alternatives, including the no action alternative. So under all alternatives that we will present today, changes are only considered to how the recreational bag size and season limits are set, and some potential changes to the recreational accountability measures. There are no changes considered to how the annual catch limits are set. There's no changes considered to the allocation to the recreational fishery or anything else that goes into how the annual catch limit is set. There's no changes considered to anything related to commercial fisheries management through this action. This is all about how do we set the recreational bag size and season limits. Under all alternatives, MRIP will continue to be the primary data source for recreational catch, harvest, discards, fishing effort, and fishing mortality. However, it may not be the main driver in determining the bag size and season limits, depending on the alternative. And under all alternatives, including the no action alternative, methods can be used to account for variability and uncertainty in the MRIP data. So first I will describe the no action alternative, which represents the current process for setting the bag size and season limits. So under the current process, the methods that are used to set the bag size and season limits can vary, but in general, we always use MRIP harvest data from 1 or more recent years to predict the impacts of either status quo or changes in the bag size and season limits. And we assume that if these measures remain unchanged, then harvest next year will be similar to harvest in recent years. Under this process, we aim to prevent RHL overages. And if expected dead discards are accurately predicted through the specifications process, like the conversations that we had yesterday, then preventing RHL overages should also prevent ACL and ABC overages. However, it is challenging to accurately predict recreational harvest and discards under any combination of measures. Harvest and discards are impacted by many factors, including things like regulations, weather, availability, changes in fishing effort, economic trends, and other factors. And the MRIP data often show considerable variations in harvest across years when the measures remained unchanged. So it's important to note that the process that we currently use does not vary based on stock status, though of course the RHL does vary based on stock status, and this method is aiming at preventing RHL overages. But beyond that, the method is the same across the whole range of stock status. And also, this process generally does not account for expected differences in availability or other factors in the upcoming year compared to in previous years. So that's a high-level summary of the kind of key points of how we currently do things for setting bag size and season limits. And next I will describe a draft alternative that's called the percent change alternative. So this alternative maintains some similarities to the no action alternative in that it maintains a comparison of an MRIP estimate to the upcoming year or year's RHL. And the MRIP estimate could be a multi-year average. It does not have to be a single year point estimate. And the intent is to compare the upcoming RHL to something like a confidence interval, or CI, around the MRIP estimate. And that allows us to account for variability and uncertainty in the MRIP estimate. So for example, the comparison that's proposed is the upcoming RHL within the confidence interval of the MRIP estimate, or is it above or below that estimate, the confidence interval, and how far above or below is it? So this alternative differs from the no action alternative in that it also includes an explicit consideration of the B to BMSY ratio when determining how, if at all, measures should change. So the way it's proposed through this alternative is that biomass would be divided into 3 different states. If it's below the target is one state, and then is it at the target but below, is it at least at the target level but below 150% of the target, or is it more than 150% of the target level? And the amount of change in the management measures depends on these 2 considerations: the magnitude of the difference between the RHL and the MRIP confidence interval, as well as where biomass falls within these 3 potential categories relative to the target. So based on those 2 considerations, that would place the fishery in one of the boxes shown on the screen here. And there's 2 tables because these are 2 slightly different ways of getting at it, but they're very similar in their approach. And they're meant to be sub-alternatives that we could further analyze, and the council and policy board could choose between one of them. But under both of these tables, the first column is you compare your upcoming RHL to the MRIP estimate and the confidence interval in terms of, is it within the confidence interval, and is it above or below? And then the next step is, what is the B to BMSY ratio? And then based on those 2 considerations, it puts you in one of the categories in the far right column, where you're either maintaining status quo or you're allowing a certain percentage liberalization or requiring a certain percent reduction. And the difference between these 2 tables is that the first table, the percent liberalization or reduction, is defined as either A, B, or C percentage. And the intent is that there would be numbers associated with those percentages. So for example, maybe A is 5%, B is 10%, and C is 15%. But the exact numbers that will be associated with A, B, and C requires further analysis to determine what's most appropriate for that, and it could vary by species, but the intent is that they would be predetermined. And so you can see on this first table that if you look at the far right, the intent on both tables really is that they're mirror images of each other. So in the middle, if your future RHL is within the confidence interval of the MRIP estimate, you're either maintaining status quo or taking a slight liberalization or reduction represented by A%, depending on where biomass is relative to the target. And then as you move kind of above or below that middle row, it's mirrored in terms of where it falls in terms of A, B, or C% or status quo, except if you move in one direction, it's liberalizations, and if you move in the other directions, it's reductions. So it's meant to be symmetrical. And then the second table is very similar in concept, except that instead of having the percent change be binned into A, B, or C%, it scales up or down based on the magnitude of the difference between the RHL and the confidence interval of the MRIP estimate. So there's a little triangle shown in the far right, and that's meant to be the delta or the difference between the RHL and the MRIP estimate, and you're multiplying that by a scalar, which is either D or E%, so that you have a bigger change in measures the farther your RHL is from the confidence interval of the MRIP estimate, and that goes in both directions. So these two approaches are very similar, just differences in terms of does the response scale up or down, or is it kind of bend into these more static categories? So the benefits of this approach overall is that it provides some stability in that there are considerations for status quo included throughout these tables. So if you look at the far right column on both, you can see there's situations where you would be in the status quo, throughout the whole range of the table. And it also minimizes fluctuations in measures because the liberalizations and reductions are constrained to either a certain percentage or a percentage times a coefficient, with the greater liberalizations allowed when biomass is high and greater restrictions required when biomass is low. So it is responding to the need to liberalize or reduce, and it's responding to biomass, but it's kind of preventing us from kind of tweaking things each year and instead providing these kind of bend approaches. So another thing that's important to note about this alternative is that it considers changes from a starting point. So it's all about, do you keep measures the same, or do you liberalize them or reduce them? So in order for this to work, your starting place for measures has to be appropriate. And the FMAT and PDT has discussed that the current management measures for these species may not be the appropriate starting point for a number of reasons. So depending on the species, we have challenges with things like widespread angler dissatisfaction with some of the measures, or the potential for notable ACL overages under the current allocations if we keep the measures unchanged. So the FMAT has talked about ways to define the appropriate starting point for each species under each of these alternatives. And they have talked about the potential to use some existing statistical models or other methods to define that starting point. But additional time is needed to further develop these ideas, and updates will be provided on that at a future Council and Policy Board meeting. So that's the summary of Alternative 2, and Savannah's going to take it over from here and describe the next few alternatives.
All right, great. Thank you, Julia. So alternative number 3 is the fishery score alternative. This alternative would combine multiple metrics into one fishery score, which would be used to determine the recreational management measures. The fishery score would be calculated each time an updated stock assessment is available with updated information. And currently this is anticipated to be every other year. So it might be appropriate to leave recreational measures unchanged in the interim years so that that would provide some stability within the recreational fishery. The 4 metrics in the alternative proposal are fishing mortality relative to FMSY, biomass relative to target BMSY, recruitment trends, and a comparison of fishery performance relative to the RHL. These metrics are not limited to 4, and can be expanded or swapped out as the fishery changes. Each metric will have a weight associated with it based on the relationship of influence it has on harvest, but in a way to prevent one metric from driving the fishery score entirely. For example, fishing mortality and biomass may be weighted more than fishery performance in comparison to the RHL. The FMAT and PDT will continue to discuss appropriate weighting schemes, but in the example provided in the briefing materials, all weights are the same for now. The fishery score provides a single value that is easy to interpret by managers and stakeholders while encompassing multiple aspects of the fishery. So it kind of takes all the metrics and puts them into one easy to digest number. Next slide, thanks. In the white box is the proposed fishery score formula. So here you see a W provided in the parentheses, which refers to the weight of each factor. To help explain how this alternative would work, an example fishery score was calculated using a scale from 0 to 5. A detailed walkthrough for each species and the calculations and how the scores were assigned can be found in the briefing book memo in Appendix A, Section 4.1. Going through the calculations, black sea bass had a fishery score of 4. So what this does is it places it in, if you look at the table, that bottom row, this places black sea bass in a low risk category, and the stock status and fishery performance outlook are good. Therefore, black sea bass would have the most liberal measures available for that species. Summer flounder had a fishery score of 3.65 and scup had a fishery score of 3.7, which indicates that they're in that third column, or third row, excuse me. So what this means is that they are at a medium risk of concern with moderate stock status and fishery performance outlook. Therefore, they would be at liberal measures, but more restricted than the most liberal measures allowed. Bluefish was not included in this example because the FMAT and PDT has not yet determined if stocks are under a rebuilding plan and if they should be used in this alternative. So this metric kind of provides a way to incorporate, like I said, multiple metrics into one number, and you can watch that number change over time and track it. And this provides just an easy to interpret methodology. Alternative 4 is the biological reference point alternative. Under this alternative, the primary metrics are the terminal year B to BMSY and F to FMSY from the most recent stock assessment. These metrics would be used to guide selection of management measures, and these management measures would be binned into 7 potential boxes as illustrated in Figure 2 on page 11. Each box would have a set of default measures which would be implemented the first time a stock is placed in that box. To determine the boxes under this alternative, F would be considered in one of 2 states, either above or below the target, which indicates whether overfishing is occurring or not. B to BMSY would be further divided to provide managers and anglers with more responsive levels of access. Therefore, the following B to BMSY bins are proposed. So an example is to have biomass greater than or equal to 1.5 times the target. Biomass is greater than or equal to the target, but less than 1.5 times the target. Biomass is less than the target, but greater than or equal to the threshold, and the threshold is half the target. Or the biomass is less than the threshold, and this means that the stock is overfished. Changes to the measures would be considered based on the following process when updated stock assessment information is available, which, as I said earlier, is anticipated to be every other year. And the first time the stock is in a new box under this alternative, the fishery would be subject to default measures of that box. If the box remains unchanged after a subsequent stock assessment update, then secondary metrics would be considered. Next slide. Thank you. Oh, go back. One too far. Okay, thank you. So trends in biomass and recruitment are what we consider secondary metrics under this alternative. And these will be used to fine-tune default measures only when stock conditions are relative to the categories above have not changed. So when we see a stock that's stable with similar F to FMSY and B to BMSY. In this case, biomass and recruitment trends will be used, as well as a comparison to the RHL to determine fishery performance. And these measures combined will either further relax measures, restrict measures, or call for the reevaluation of measures. As such, trends in biomass and recruitment would impact the management measures, but to a lesser extent than the relationship of F and biomass to the biological reference points. The incorporation of an additional secondary metric of fishery performance, only when overfishing is occurring, ensures that there is accountability to an ACL or an RHL by triggering a management response, which is restriction and reevaluation of measures. And this occurs when the recreational fishery contributes to overfishing by exceeding their limits when the stock condition is of concern. All right, next slide. Shown here is Figure 2, found on page 11. As I mentioned earlier, changes to the measures would be considered when updated stock assessment information is available, which is currently anticipated to be every other year. So the first time a stock is in a new box, the fishery would be subject to default measures. If that box remains unchanged after a subsequent stock assessment update, then trends in the recruitment and biomass would be considered to determine if measures remain unchanged or if limited liberalizations and reductions can be permitted. So liberalizations within a box are only allowed in boxes 1 and 2, which are associated with the healthy stock status and are colored in green here. Restrictions and/or reevaluations within a box can be required based on secondary metrics for boxes 3 through 6. This allows for relative stability if stock status is unchanged, but also room for tuning of measures if biomass or recruitment trends warrant it. It is intended that changes within a box would be based on predetermined guidelines. So liberalizations are not permitted when biomass is below the target level or when F exceeds FMSY. For example, if a stock in box 2, which indicates that F is below FMSY, but biomass is below the 150% BMSY, and the stock remains in box 2 based on updated stock status, then measures may be liberalized to preset measures if recruitment or biomass are trending upwards. If either of those are trending down, then measures would stay status quo. If the updated stock assessment information indicates biomass exceeds 150% of BMSY, then the stock would move into box 1, triggering a new set of default measures that are more relaxed from those of box 2. So for some examples, based on the 2021 stock assessments for each species, black sea bass and scup are in box 1 with default measures or the most restrictive measures of that box. If they remain in box 1 at the next stock assessment cycle, then measures may be more liberalized if biomass or recruitment are trending up. If they are trending down, measures will remain at default measures. Summer flounder was placed in box 3 at default measures, which are the most illiberal allowed within that box. If summer flounder remains in box 3 at the next assessment, then measures may be more restricted if biomass or recruitment is trending downwards. Otherwise, measures will remain at default measures. Additional details are provided in Appendix C. Bluefish is in box 7, which indicates that they are in a rebuilding plan. The PDT and FMAT has not yet determined if it is appropriate for management measures to be set using this alternative for stocks in a rebuilding plan. The final alternative is Alternative 5, the biomass-based matrix alternative. This alternative uses a matrix to set recreational measures based on 2 factors, B to BMSY, and the most recent trend in biomass, either increasing, stable, or decreasing. Using these 2 factors in 4 parameters for each provides a 3x4 matrix to determine the appropriate measure or step. Step A represents optimal conditions, while step F represents the worst conditions. Certain pairs of conditions, such as a healthy stock that is increasing or an abundant stock with any biomass trend, are treated as equivalent to reduce the number of steps to 6. So here's the biomass matrix that I just described for you. As I said, biomass or stock status, is defined 4 different ways. It's either abundant, which means the stock is at least 150% of the target level or BMSY. Healthy, which means the stock is above the target but less than 150% of the target. Below target means that the stock is below the target but above the threshold. And overfished means that the stock is below the threshold. When biomass exceeds 150% of the target level, regardless of biomass trend, Step A measures are selected. This special condition is aimed at providing an opportunity to keep recreational management measures aligned with stock status, which in this case is significantly above the target. When a stock is fished at FMSY, it is expected that stock size will decrease towards the biomass target unless above average recruitment events occur. Thus, it is not necessarily a negative sign if a stock at such high biomass levels experiences a declining trend. The details of the application of this alternative for summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, and bluefish is provided in Appendix D. Black sea bass and scup are listed in Step A under this alternative with an abundant stock status but decreasing biomass trends. Summer flounder is at Step C, with stock status below target, but an increasing biomass trend. Bluefish is at Step F with an overfish stock status and a stable biomass trend. Proposed accountability measures across all the alternatives could be similar, so I'm going to cover them together. Proactive accountability measures are built into all of the alternatives. Alternative 1, which is status quo, includes setting measures to prevent RHL overages. Alternative 2 has a greater chance of restrictions and less of a chance for liberalizations when stock status is poor. For alternatives 3 through 5, movement to a more or less restrictive bin based on stock status and/or fishery performance based on the alternative specifics. Reactive accountability measures are still being worked through by the FMAT and PDT, but considerations include maintaining catch to the ACL, and whether other fishery performance metrics such as F compared to FMSY should be included in reactive accountability measures. So having gone through all the alternatives that we've come up with so far, here's an outline of milestones for 2022 final approval and implementation. As you can see, we have a lot of milestones to make it for 2022. The FMAT and PDT has prepared and plans on continuing the development of all 5 alternatives presented today. Final action on a framework and addendum is possible in early 2022, but is ambition and is under the assumption that there are no delays or slowdowns in the process. With the harvest control rule process entering an official management document pipeline, the process should be clear to both managers and stakeholders. These milestones are subject to change and are not set in stone, but this is where we are at now. After this meeting, the PDT and FMAT will continue to work on developing alternatives and begin drafting the framework and draft addendum. A subgroup of the SSC will review both models currently proposed for use for the alternatives to determine management measures in late September 2021. These models may be revised based on SSC input, and it should be noted that one model has only been developed for summer flounder, and this is the management strategy evaluation model. And the other model has been developed for summer flounder and black sea bass, and this is the recreational fleet dynamics model. 2 public comment periods, one to get stakeholder input on measures under certain management scenarios in the fall, and one as part of the Commission's addendum process will be available for public input. If the draft addendum is approved for public comment in October, then public hearings would take place in November and December, with final action proposed for February 2022. Recreational measures for 2022 would be set after that. So additionally, it is important to note that this framework and addendum will only be defining the process for setting recreational measures, not the actual measures themselves. Those will need to be set separately after input from the public, monitoring committee, and advisory panels, with the council and board having final approval. They would also be revised through the specifications process. While there is no concrete action needed today, the FMAT and PDT is hoping to get feedback from the board and council on the alternatives presented today, and if they represent the intended direction for this action. And with that, Julia and I are happy to take any questions from the council and board, along with any comments or feedback they are willing to provide.
Thanks so much, Julia and Savannah, for your presentation. Are there any questions at this time? I see a few hands. Let's see who we got first. Go ahead, Peter. Peter Defer, I'll have your hand first.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for a great presentation. It's very good, and it is very clear. There were a couple of things that I was curious about. The first one being how each one of these treats something like bluefish, which is under a rebuilding plan because it's both overfished and overfishing is occurring, or under those circumstances. So at least 2 of the options had some sort of indication for an overfished condition, which seemed to indicate that none of the rest of the options applied. That basically all bets were off under an overfished condition. So is that true for all of the options?
Hey, Peter, thank you for that great question. So stocks that are under a rebuilding plan are still something that the PDT and FMAT is currently discussing and trying to address, whether all the alternatives are appropriate, only some. So for now, we just provided kind of where the PDT FMAT is at, but that could change based on further discussion and feedback from this body.
Okay, thank you. A follow-up, Mr. Chairman. Please. I think we have a history and a database that suggests we've had some experience with rapidly increasing and rapidly decreasing stocks. And those are, of course, 2 of the most controversial and difficult decisions where we're coming to make. So has the PDT examined how each one of these alternatives works under those conditions when a stock, for example, is increasing sufficiently rapidly that under the current circumstances we have dramatically increased quota, and we've done that, or cut it dramatically, and we've done that in recent years too. So have we sort of tested the system with those examples that we've already got?
So that's another great question, Peter. So we have touched on some species because there are a lot of alternatives we've been discussing quite a bit. And some of these alternatives, when we were designing them, discussing them, we did consider how to make sure that the recreational fishery doesn't experience whiplash from really crazy trends increasing and decreasing between stock assessments. And so that is something that we have looked at quite a bit, and it's something that we will continue to look at to make sure that whatever alternative we have in place, whatever structure, isn't going to dramatically change very quickly, because we do want to make sure that we do provide some sort of stability while accommodating changing stock status.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Peter. I appreciate it. And thanks, Savannah, for your sufficient answer. I'm going to go next. I've got a number of hands right now. I'm going to go next to Tom Fody, and then Mike Pentney. You're on deck. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, when I was looking through this, when you're going through, if I understand this right, like summer flounder has had poor recruitment for a number of years, and it's not based on fishing pressure or spawning stock biomass, but on environmental conditions. That means we would never be allowed to use these alternatives.
Hey, Tom. So again, that's a great question, and that it's really hard to get a handle on changing environmental impacts and their, especially their impact on recruitment. And so some of these alternatives do incorporate a recruitment metric, usually based on a trend. And so that's kind of our way at trying to get at incorporating that into some of these alternatives, because like I said, it is hard to kind of understand and have a quantifiable value for environmental impact. So by providing a suite of metrics, we're hoping to try to capture some of the more difficult to capture aspects of these fisheries. So for summer flounder, I won't speak to be an expert on that species, but with something that does have some declining recruitment, that would be accounted for in some of these alternatives, but not all.
Okay. Mike, one follow-up.
Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Basically, I'm thinking about, I looked through this, and the presentation was very good, very thorough, and kind of fast, and I'm used to all these kinds of presentations. I think it'd be helpful before we go to the public hearing is to maybe take the advisors and do like a workshop. So, because we might need more time to go over these things when we go out to the public. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Yeah, we'll take that under consideration. I do have a question. I'm going to jump in, Mike. I'm sorry, right before you. I had a thought as you guys were Julia and Savannah were working through the presentation. Have you given any, and I may have missed it in your presentation, but have you given any thought to regionality? I guess that's a word. You know, there's just such differences between the different regions and some of these fisheries. As we work through this harvest control rule, have the regions been considered, or are we looking at a kind of a one-stop shop for bag and season and size limit kind of thing?
This is Julia. I'll take that one. We're gonna, tag team answering questions.
Of course, yeah. Thanks, Julia.
So I think the short answer is that regions can be considered through this. Savannah briefly mentioned that there's 2 existing models that can be used to determine the impacts of any combination of bag size and season limit at the state level, regional level, or coastwide level. And those models are going to be reviewed by a subgroup of the SSC next month, and then the FMAT and PDT hopes to use those models to do the next really important step of this, or one, really important step that we still haven't gotten to yet, is we take these methods and then we put example management measures on each of the steps to see what exactly would, the step A measures look like compared to the step B measures, for example. And when we get to that stage, we are imagining that it is possible that it could be that, step A measures, for example, could mean this bag size and season limit for one region and a different bag size and season limit for another region, kind of acknowledging that that's the way that some of these fisheries are already managed. I think everybody probably knows that it's easiest from a number of perspectives in terms of analyzing the impacts and predicting impacts if everybody has the same management measures everywhere throughout the coast, but we know that that's not what, the states want, that we don't have that right now for some of these fisheries. So short answer is that we do think that regional differences in the management measures can be built into this if it's the desire of the council and board to keep that.
Yeah, thanks, Julia, for that. If I had a say, or I guess I do, I would like to see the consideration of the regions in further analysis. I don't know if we'll have support for that by other members of the policy board and the council, but let's go ahead and work through the different names that I have on the board here. Tom Fody, your hand's still up. I'm going to skip you for now and go down to Mike Pentney. Go ahead, Mike.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I don't actually have a question. I just wanted to compliment the FMAT PDT on the presentation and the work that they've done since the last meeting. I spoke quite a bit at the last meeting, hoping to get the commission and the council to kind of focus on this step of identifying, a range of alternatives for the first part of the harvest control rule approach, which is what they've done, and I think they did an outstanding job, and I'm really pleased with the range of alternatives that they've presented today. I think that's exactly what I was hoping they would accomplish and we'd be able to discuss today. Mr. Chairman, and just in response to your comment or question about the regional approaches, I agree. I think that there has to be some thought given to how conservation equivalency fits into this whole process, but also, recognize that the first step in the council's work each year is to identify a set of coastwide measures that would apply. And then, under the commission plan, generally, conservation equivalency becomes an option for either state by state or region by region measures that together provide the same equivalent conservation, if you will, to the coastwide measures. And so I think this can still, that framework can still operate within this scheme, because you've got, even if we use this to set the coastwide to determine what coastwide measures would be in a given year for a given condition, then those coastwide measures become the baseline for creating some region by region or state by state conservation equivalency measures. So I still think this framework doesn't preclude that approach, and so I think this is a really good start. And I also recognize that, and Julia touched on this, that I think the biggest challenge in front of us now for the harvest control rule approach is going to be determining what measures apply in each of these different bins. And I think that, to my mind, that should really be the focus now. The PDT has given us a really good start with these alternatives, and I'd really like to see them now turn their attention and focus on the actual measures that would apply, using the different modeling approaches or some other approaches to come up with the measures that would apply in each bin. So that's all. Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the PDT and the FMAT for the good work.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Mike, and yeah, they've done an excellent job. The one thing I think we're going to have to keep an eye on, and I know that you're following along because you're part of the Lang State ASMFC, there's been a lot of discussion about conservation equivalency and how it may move forward, based on suggestions by some board members. So it's just, we don't want to get ourselves in a bind where we don't kind of incorporate what's being discussed at ASMFC with what's being talked about here. That's why we're here jointly. But we just need to keep an eye on what's being talked about as far as policy changes on conservation equivalency. I think that's going to be an important thing for the next year or so. I'm going to go next. I've got a number of hands right now, and that's great. I'd love to hear from everybody. We're trying to provide feedback to the FMAT and PDT on where to go next. I'm going to start with Michelle Duvall, and then Megan Ware, you're on deck. Go ahead, Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to echo Mike Pentney's comments to the FMAT and the PDT, just a tremendous amount of work. And I was super impressed with what you all have been able to pull together in a short period of time. Peter Defer asked one of my questions about treatment of overfished stocks and under alternatives 2 and 3. So I guess I would encourage more dialogue about that. And it leads to one of my other questions, which was just, I noticed that in the fishery score example, there's a different set of inflection points that's used for that B to BMSY ratio. And so I was curious about the thinking behind that, given that, the rest of the alternatives in the document, use pretty much the same set of inflection points. And then I just have a couple follow-ups after that. Thanks.
Hey, Michelle, this is Savannah. I'm going to take this question. Hopefully I can answer that. And if I don't, I'm always happy to discuss this in detail if you have some specific questions after the meeting. But the different inflection points for the fishery score were designed to try to find a quantitative way to assign a number value to each of the metrics. And so having multiple metrics and trying to find an appropriate way to give them a score from 1 to 5, which is the example used here. Yeah, Julia's going to go back to it. Yeah, and so in order to try to find this one value for a fishery score, we kind of had to find a way that was appropriate in which to decide what was a 5 versus a 4. And so that's why you kind of see some of the differences here. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, maybe I'll follow up with you later, Savannah. It was really more about I think, just the use of the B to BMSY ratio, like it, for a score of 1, it's B over BMSY at 0.25. So, that's certainly something that would be overfished, and a score of 2 for that B over BMSY metric, also goes down into that overfished category. So that was really my question, but I can follow up with you offline about that. I guess, just a couple of other comments or thoughts as I was reading through this, and just appreciating that this is a super ambitious timeline that's been laid out here. And, I agree with other commenters on the importance of getting public input on the measures. And, I notice that sort of it seems like a workshop approach has been proposed in this next step. So I'm curious to hear a little bit more about that. And then I was also wondering, a couple more things, if the PDT had any conversation about, any one of these alternatives would be a pretty big wholesale change to how we manage our recreational fisheries. And so had there been any conversation about perhaps trying this out on, one stock first? I mean, I recognize you guys are doing your best to provide examples of how this might work. But I guess I maybe throw that out there for all of us to think about, as this effort moves forward for, implementing this for everything all at once versus, perhaps thinking about one or two species. And then finally, I was just curious if there'd been any consideration given to, and this might be coming up next as you all discuss measures associated with different steps, but just the risk example that Dr. Rago provided from, or immediately after the last meeting. So I realize it's a lot to chew on and apologize, but again, just want to thank the FMAT and PDT for all that work. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Savannah or Julia, do you guys have anything you want to, any response to those comments, or do you want to move on?
This is Julia. I guess I'll just maybe kind of put it back on the council and board in terms of the idea of, do we start with one species first or try to do all of them together? And I put the next steps details up on the screen here to remind you of all the major milestones that we think are needed to get to a place where we can, oh, hold on. Okay, maybe it's on the screen now. Sorry, I didn't. Anyway.
Yeah,
so
it's up there
I
now,
think that
Julia.
could
You're
be
good.
a discussion question for the council and board. I think it's important to think about this timeline, what's realistic. This timeline is pretty ambitious. Also, we kind of touched on these two models that are in existence that we could use to set the management measures. Savannah noted that one of them is currently only available for summer flounder, one's available for summer flounder and black sea bass, so we don't have either of them available for scupper bluefish, so we would have to use a different way to set management measures at this point in time for those species. So I think there's a bunch of different considerations there. I think I would prefer to honestly just turn that back on the council and board in terms of what's your preference for how we go about these next steps. I think I'll leave it at that for now.
All right, thanks, Julia. No, I appreciate that. And yeah, I mean, you guys have done a tremendous job of putting this together, and now it's our turn to weigh in, and that's what we're here for today. So we had a lot of good discussion so far. I do still have, I have a tremendous number of hands here. I'm going to try to work through them the best I can. We have until 11 o'clock, I believe, on the agenda to work through this. So let me go next to Megan Ware, and then Chris Bat-Savage, you'll be on deck. Go ahead, Megan.
Thank you, Mike. I'm filling in for Pat today. So I had a question and then a comment, and I'll start with the question. It seems like all of these alternatives heavily rely on knowing what your current biomass is, and then some of them also rely on knowing what your current F rate is. And I'm just curious kind of how this would work if we did not know those numbers. So for example, if a stock assessment did not pass peer review, what would we do? We've had situations before, maybe not in the Mid-Atlantic, but in New England, where a stock assessment did not pass peer review. So I'm just curious if there's been a discussion about that.
Hey, Megan, this is Savannah. Yes, we have discussed that, and we do recognize that is a very realistic outcome, that we don't have a stock assessment. And if that's the case, that's something that the PDT and FMAT is continuing to discuss. We have had a few discussions about perhaps having some sort of decision tree to follow if there is no stock assessment available. And so there will be included in these alternatives, as we continue to develop them, kind of a plan B if there is no stock assessment available. So yes, the FMAT and PDT has discussed that and will continue to discuss that.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. And then just a quick comment. I saw in kind of the worked example of the fishery score example, one of the scores is based on the terminal year of recruitment. And at least from my experience, that terminal year recruitment is usually the most uncertain. So I would be a little cautious in putting too much stock into what that value is, but maybe the second to last year, or, like the last 3 years compared to a longer time series, might be something to consider there. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Megan, for those comments. Very much appreciated. Chris Bat-Savage, we got you next, and then Peter Hughes, you're on deck.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Savannah and Julia, for the great presentation. Impressed by the alternatives. Megan actually just touched on one of the thoughts I had regarding recruitment. But on that topic, on alternative 3, your recruitment in the terminal year is compared to the last 3 years of recruitment estimates. Did the FMAT and PDT talk about maybe comparing it to the time series average that we typically see in the stock assessments to, I guess, get a better sense of what recruitment is currently like, compared to what we've seen over the course of a few decades? And after that I have a follow-up comment. Thanks.
Hey, Chris, this is Savannah. I'm going to take that question. So for that recruitment metric, that's just an example of how we could get to recruitment. There's been discussion on what would be the most appropriate way to kind of get at that recruitment metric, whether it's, as you said, comparison to like a historical baseline. We've talked about maybe doing like a trend for recruitment, but for this meeting in this example, we just left it as terminal year compared to the average, just to have something to put down to kind of start conversation and see if there was maybe a preference or some comments from the council and board. So that's something that we are still considering and trying to determine the best way to have that recruitment metric.
Great. Yeah, I appreciate that response. And I guess the question that Julia posed to the policy board and the council, I guess, regarding timing. I know we're all concerned about the potential impacts to the recreational fishery next year with the 2020 harvest estimates and the current allocations that are in place. But it seems like there's a lot of steps that still need to be covered in order to fully develop any of these alternatives. And we've heard talks about maybe getting workshops and things together to make sure the public have a full understanding of what we're doing, because it's a big departure from what we've done. Thinking about that, it's probably more realistic that 2023 might be when this all gets implemented instead of 2022. Curious to hear what other people think, but I think just in terms of managing expectations and making sure we get this right, 2023 might be the more appropriate target year. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chris. I guess I'll turn to staff to see what the work plan is. But with comments today and further development, it does seem to be a little bit close to trying to get something done by 2022. So I appreciate those thoughts, Chris. I'm not going to go to staff at this point. It's just something to think about. We're going to have more time to discuss this in future meetings. But I'm going to try to get through the list of hands that I have right now. Peter Hughes is up next, and then Dewey, you'll be after Peter. So go ahead, Peter Hughes.
Great. Good morning, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yep, I hear you loud and clear.
Great. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I have a couple of questions and a comment. I'm not sure how they're going to come out, but Savannah, I think I heard during part of your presentation that there were going to be 2 public hearings, one through ASFMC and one through MAFMC. Is there going to only be 2, or Mid-Atlantic is going to host a series of public hearings and ASFMC is going to host a series of public hearings?
Hey, Peter, this is Savannah. Thanks for that question. So currently, the public hearing process on the addendum will follow the commission outline. And then for the work groups to solicit stakeholder input, as outlined here on the screen, we're still working through how that's going to function, if we're just going to have one session or multiple sessions to try to capture regionality. But we're going to try to provide as much opportunity as possible to try to get public input. And a lot of that does depend on the timeline as well, how much time we do have to gather that input from the public.
Great, thanks. I mean, I just know in New Jersey, there's going to be a ton of interested parties that would probably benefit from a public hearing. Another thing I heard a couple of speakers say is that hosting a workshop. You know, I support that. What you presented here today is a ton of information. And I guess my question is given the complicated nature and the drastic management change in methodology, is this still frame workable?
So I won't speak for this. I'm going to actually turn it over to Garfo. From the commission side, we are confident that an addendum is the best way forward, but I'm going to let Garfo answer the framework question.
Yeah, and so before we go to Garfo, Savannah, an addendum requires 2 meetings, and this, you know, I know it's similar to a framework, but you know, this being meeting 1, another meeting between now and the end of the year could be enough. But yeah, I mean, I think Garfo could weigh in on the framework side, whether or not this is getting too complicated for a framework. I don't know. Let me see who's on my list here. I know Mike Penny's on the call. Mike, do you have anything you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, so thanks, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the question. And, you know, I think for probably around a year, we've been, you know, since Julia first put the matrix together that listed under rec reform, you know, some concepts that could be addressed more informally, some concepts that could be addressed through a framework adjustment, and then a couple actions that would require an amendment. Since that time, we've been looking at this harvest control rule approach in the framework bin. And while the individual alternatives that the PDT FMAT have put forward today, you know, some of them are more complicated than others in terms of the data and information and the metrics that are used or evaluated to determine what bin we're in. The end result is uniformly the same across all of these. You take some information that's generally readily available as a result of the stock assessment update, and you determine what bin you're in, and then that drives the bag season and size limit for the following year. You know, given all of that, I think we're still operating safely within the bounds of a framework adjustment. If we started to go down the road of significant changes to the accountability measures and other things that sort of go beyond what would be necessary to implement the harvest control rule approach, you know, then it's possible. But even then, changes to accountability measures are acceptable as a framework adjustment. So at this point, I don't see any concerns with what the PDT FMAT have laid out, recognizing that the complexity is in the data and the derivation of the metrics and the assignment of the bins. But I mean, once we adopt, you know, if we were to go forward with this and we adopt a particular alternative, the important piece is you know, using the information that we have on hand to determine what bin we're in, and then using that bin to set the measures for the following year. So I don't see that as being worrisome in terms of using a framework adjustment.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Savannah.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Mike. So I'm going to skip ahead. And Peter, did you have a follow-up at all, or are you good at this point?
I'm good. Thank you very much, Mr.
Okay.
Chairman.
Yeah, thanks for your question. I'm going to jump down. Tony Kearns put her hand up. Tony, did you have something you wanted to speak to based on the question that was asked?
I just want to make sure it's clear that it's just a regular addendum process. There's not a number of board meetings that occur or anything. It's, the addendum is out for 30 days or more, depending on how much public comment the board wants to go out for. We can have hearings in states just like we normally do. And with the measures that are within the document, an addendum is a viable way forward.
Okay. All right, thanks, Tony. I might put, based on the questions that were asked, I hate to put Chris on the spot. Chris Moore, are you with us?
Absolutely.
So when as you've been discussing this with staff, it came, Peter asked the question about just having two public hearings. Is that the plan still? We would just do two webinar public hearings?
So, thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't think we've gotten that far yet in terms of the details. We really need to explore exactly what we plan to do with this particular action. I think, getting back to Chris Savage's earlier point, the milestones that we're looking at here are, I'd say, even in the aspirational category. You're definitely ambitious, and I'm pushing into aspirational. So we really need to talk about how all this is going to get done in the time frame that we see in front of us today. And certainly once we figure out exactly what's going to be in this framework, then we could talk about what we want to, or what we plan to do relative to public hearings. So we've heard about a workshop, we've heard about public hearings. Our requirements for a framework are pretty minimal, but I can't imagine that we'd be able to get away with just 2 public hearings without a lot of the folks in the public being upset about that. So yeah, we really need to consider it as we move forward. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Chris. Yeah, there's a lot of good comments coming from members of the council and the commission at this point. I think I'm hoping that staff are taking these comments in. I'm sure they are, and we can develop this throughout the fall. But I appreciate that, Chris. So let me see who's next here. I've got Dewey Hemmelwright, you're next, and then Nicola, you're on deck for after Dewey. Go ahead, Dewey.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for the very informative presentation. There's a lot to take in. I agree with a lot of the concerns people have stated, about educating the public more and public meetings. My question would be, given the departure from the norm with this, once you have a bag size and season limit that's based on the size of the stock, how do you conform to how many people are going to go fishing? How does that work? With estimations or with ever changing, even though the stock size could change, and that's predictable based on the stock assessments or best available. How do you predict the effort part? Can somebody help explain that? And I'm hoping to educate myself further for this, because there's a few questions that I have that would be offline, but that's probably one of the ones, given that in the past, you have a annual catch limit, and we had problems constraining catch to that sometimes, and this will be different to a stock size. How do you estimate how many people are going to go fishing? Thank you.
Yeah, Dewey, thanks for the question. I mean, effort is one of the things that's probably the hardest thing to control. We talk a lot about it at the commission, as well as the council. But you know, I think, I don't know. Yeah, it's really a tough thing. It's a tough thing to try to understand, and I think we use averages to the best we can to understand effort. I mean, it's part of the MRIP survey, so we have good numbers throughout the Mid-Atlantic and New England. But maybe I'll go to staff and see if there's something that you might want to offer, either Julia or Savannah, on that question. I know it's a really hard thing to try to figure out and try to how to control, but let me see if you guys have any thoughts.
Yeah, this is Julia. I'll take a stab at it. And yeah, I think that's the key point that I would say too, is that effort is hard to predict what future effort is going to be in the recreational fisheries, and we don't have, you know, the same degree of effort controls in the recreational fishery as we have in the commercial fishery. So I think that's part of the challenge with relying on the MRIP data, and it's part of the basically uncertainty that we struggle with in the recreational fishery in terms of what's happening right now and how might things be different if we change our management measures. So the alternatives don't consider any explicit like predictions of effort or calculations of effort that would factor into any of this. But I would say that if we think about it like it's something that is, you know, in some ways a source of uncertainty, some of these alternatives are trying to get at more appropriately dealing with the uncertainty in the MRIP data by taking these kind of binned approaches and not trying to be so precise about trying to tweak the measures so we exactly meet an RHL in a future year, that we're taking an approach where like a range of conditions are, you know, binned within step A measures, for example, or step B measures. And part of the rationale for that is because we know that we have variability in things like effort that can result in different levels of harvest, even under the same management measures. So, you know, it's not really kind of resolving that issue, but it's considering ways to maybe more appropriately address those uncertainties by trying to bin our management responses instead of trying to be really precise about meeting an RHL.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Julia, for that. I did see Savannah's hand up. Savannah, did you want to address that question, or did you have something else that I can come back to you later on?
Hey, Mike, thanks. Yeah, no, I had my hand up to try to address the public hearing discussion earlier, but you can come back to me, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Yeah, if you want to leave your hand up, I'll come back to you. I still have about 5 or 6, maybe 7 or 8 hands that are up at this point. And it's all been a very good discussion. I hope that you guys are getting the feedback that you need. Dewey, did you have anything you wanted to follow up on based on Julia's comment?
So I think that was good. I just listening to the I'm fine. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, you raise a great point, and I do think that effort is one of the most challenging things that, I mean, how do you control effort? It's a very difficult thing to do from the fisheries management perspective. And, you know, it's a great point. And, you know, I guess we'll work through that and try to get some more feedback from the public on how we control that effort, you know, under this framework addendum. So, but thanks, Dewey, for your question and comment. I'm going to go next to Nicola, and then Adam, you'll be up after Nicola. So go ahead, Nicola.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, and kudos to the team for this effort on what I think we're all understanding to be a pretty complex topic. And in my own effort to kind of unpack these alternatives and compare them, I've been thinking about them, in terms of the number of metrics that each one's incorporates, be it biomass or F and recruitment, and then also how many steps each one has that requires a different set of predetermined measures. And my question is about alternative 4 and how many of those different predetermined steps there are. I saw that there were, there's 7 different boxes, but it sounds like some of those boxes have multiple sets of predetermined measures that would need to be selected. So if I could just get some clarification on that, and then I'd have a follow-up comment.
Hi, Nicola. This is Savannah. Thank you for the question. So yeah, alternative 4 does have probably the most steps and potential measures outlined needed. And this was done for a few reasons. The first one is for this alternative was designed so that you would initially just have 6 initial default measures for each box. The secondary metrics such as biomass and recruitment and the specific management measures associated with changes in those trends would come in only if the stock remained in that box. And so this design was, we came up with this design to try to address some of the problems we've had in the fishery, and maybe fine-tuning management measures to address like good biomass but declines in recruitment, or like in summer flounder, we can really try to tailor measures to get at why the biomass isn't growing even with low F. Maybe we need to fine-tune regulations around recruitment or ways to increase biomass. And so the thought behind the biological reference point was to have kind of a more tailored approach. So it does involve more management measures being preset, but the hope is that the stocks will respond and we can focus primarily on the 6 main measures.
Okay, thank you, Savannah. I appreciate that response. And it does, I think as difficult as it is coming up with these different alternatives, how selecting those different measures is going to be a challenging part of the process as well. And so this option just struck me as having to have a lot of those measures, particularly if you, are looking at it in a regional process, like I would encourage the PDT and FMAT to do, and just trying to balance a responsive management approach with another goal of having stability in the measures. And I guess I would just add that the 2023 timeline does seem a little bit more realistic to me, given all the intricacies here. And lastly, there was one slide at the end that said that the addendum would be defining the process and not those certain predetermined measures, I think. And I could use some clarity on that the addendum and framework they would include those sets of measures in them, and if not, where would they be defined?
Hey, Nicola, thank you for that. And I'm happy to go over the biological reference point alternative as well after the meeting. If you do have further feedback and questions, I'd love to hear them. But as for this statement here about what the framework and addendum would get at, so our goal is that the framework and addendum would outline the process. It would pick the alternative that will be used to set management measures, because the FMAT and PDT understands that as technology and as modeling evolves, there might be different ways that can be applied and used to set appropriate measures. And we don't want to restrict the changing of measures or the process or the way that management measures are set to having to do a new framework and addendum every time measures needed to be reevaluated. And so the framework and addendum will just outline the process and kind of the framework for How we get to those measures and then the actual measures themselves and how we determine those will be set through the specifications process and built into that annual process.
Okay, thank you, Savannah.
Yeah, thanks for that question and answer, Nicola and Savannah. I'm going to go next to Adam Nowalski, and then Joe Cimino. You're up after Adam. Go ahead, Adam.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Good morning. I will say that I understand you're seeing a bunch of hands and thinking to yourself as chair, how am I going to get all these people in the time we have allotted? Not having to have to wear a chair hat today, and just as a member of the policy board, I think it's wonderful the level of participation from the board and the chair here today. The level of engagement from everyone should be a clear indicator to the public that we are very engaged in this. We're dealing with something that for the better part of the last 2 decades, we've followed the same process for setting rec measures with regards to size, season, and bag limit. So I think this is really a groundbreaking day that we have at least 4 other options in front of us to consider moving forward. And again, it should be a clear indicator to the public. This question of how do we control recreational effort, it certainly is a good one. I'll just mention that, like a lot of commercial counterparts, understand infrastructure drives a lot of that. You can't go fishing if you can't get bait. You can't go fishing if you don't have tackle. If you want to go out on the ocean, you can't go fishing if you don't have a boat or access to a for-hire vessel. That infrastructure does not change overnight. I think we have a number of indicators, including the MRIP survey itself, which was meant to provide input to these trends, so we could see those signals of effort changes over time. With regards to some specific recommendations for things for the FMAT and PDT to look at moving forward, a couple items with regards to alternative 2. First is that I would suggest the comment that I've heard was that with regards to considerations about the starting point, I think perhaps one of the strengths of this approach the FMAT and PDT should look at is consideration that this actually does not depend on a proper starting point. It would certainly benefit from it, but it actually provides a way to do things that we can't do right now. For example, we have stocks that are very high biomass levels. We don't have a path forward to liberalizations on them. This provides that path forward. So I think the FMAT PDT, taking a better look at that would be beneficial. Obviously, defining all of the variables that are in here, bringing that back as a range certainly needs to be a focus. And I might also suggest consideration of what some of the alternatives in this document do with regards to possibly adding another way to incorporate biomass trend or recruitment in addition to just stock status here. A comment for consideration across all of these alternatives is that most of these alternatives share a common set of breakpoints, and as you can see here on the screen, less than the target, relatively healthy between 1 and 150% of the biomass and 150% of the biomass. As the document touches on, these are largely driven right now by the Council's risk policy inflection points. So I would hope that the FMAT and PDT should consider if the Council's risk policy should change at some point in the future, would that trigger a change with this, or what other thoughts they might have about how to incorporate that. After those comments, I'll close with 2 questions, one to the board and one to maybe the service, whoever wants to take a stab at it. With regards to these options, alternative 2 and had specified that this was primarily to be used for species that are not in a rebuilding plan. Alternative 3 didn't have a place to put bluefish graphically with it in a rebuilding plan. 4 and 5 treat bluefish differently as a rebuilding plan. The policy board recently considered whether or not they wanted to continue with this at the policy board or send it back to the species board. We've heard some ideas today about maybe piloting this for some other species. So my question is today a time for the policy board to consider maybe bumping this back to the summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass board to work on this with an eye towards how it might work for bluefish or what that timeline might be? And the second question would be with regards to timeline of implementation for measures for any of this. The service has made clear, and I'm extremely appreciative of their input and work on this effort, putting forth an alternative participation in the FMAP PDT. For 2022, are we making significant progress now that we have the most recent management track assessments, and that at least for summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass, we didn't get any dire news for any of those species. Are we making the headway needed that, barring unforeseen circumstances, the service could contemplate status quo measures in 2022 if we continue to make the progress that we're making but aren't ready to implement this for next year? Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, Adam. There was a lot there, but I appreciate your comment and your questions. I don't have answers for you, but I guess I can turn to Mike Pentney to your last question. I don't know, Mike, do you have any thoughts as to where we might stand for 2022?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Given the progress we're making?
Well, I mean, the FMAT and the PDT have made great progress, no doubt. And I mentioned that earlier, that I really appreciate the work and the thought that they've done to come up with, what I view as a very solid range of alternatives for this piece, this part of the action. But their presentation recognizes that there's still a lot of work to do on the second piece, which is arguably the more complicated piece, because it's determining what actual measures or what process we will use to set the measures in a given year. So, while we've made good progress, there's still a lot left to do before we know what the recreational harvest control rule would look like, how it would operate, and how the measures for a given year for a particular species might be different than what the status quo measures are. So I can't give a good answer to Adam's question as to whether we've made sufficient progress to argue for status quo, in 2022. I think that remains to be seen based on what happens in October and December of this year. And, I have for quite a while now been urging the council and the commission boards to really prioritize this rec reform action so that we'd have more certainty about what measures would be necessary and appropriate in 2022. While good progress has been made, we're not seeing the end, the light at the end of the tunnel yet on this. One thing maybe to kind of cut to the chase, because I had my hand up to make a comment, given that we've got 30 minutes left on the agenda for this. What I would hope we can do today, and there've been a lot of good comments and a lot of good questions thus far from the members of the board and the council. But what I would hope we could do today is, as a board and council, simply accept what the PDT FMAT have presented to us as the range of alternatives for this part of the framework and addendum. Allow the PDT and the FMAT, based on the questions and the comments that they've heard this morning, to iron out some of the details. I still think there's, you know, little in the details, there are some issues that could be addressed and fleshed out. And really focus between now and October and December on the second piece of how we would identify what measures would be appropriate for each species in the different bins, or at least the process that we would use. They could spend that time, you know, also working with the public, advisory panels to the extent that that makes sense. But really, rather than focusing between now and October or October and December on different alternatives, more alternatives, options within the alternatives, let's accept this as a really strong starting point, or a really strong range of alternatives, and give direction to the PDT and FMAT to focus on the second piece for the measures. I think if we're able to do that so that we've got something more concrete, either in October or in as late as December, then we can have a conversation about the implications of that level of progress for the decision that the council and the board will have to make in December for 2022. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Mike. Are you interested in providing a motion? We had a staff motion that was prepared. You made it sound like you had a pretty definitive process that you're looking at going forward. I can come back to you. I still have some hands up for questions and comments, but I think at some point here we have about 30 minutes left on our agenda. We will need a motion. So
okay, I'd be happy to make the motion. And if I wasn't sure that we were looking for a motion. You mentioned earlier just sort of trying to operate by consensus.
Well, I think a motion would help, but I also we don't have any defining rules between the policy board and the council as how they would operate. It's just not something that we've determined yet. So let's do this.
Well,
let me take a few more questions. I have some people that haven't had a chance to speak yet, and then I'll come back to a motion to, as you mentioned, Mike. You know, the range of alternatives I think is it's broad and it's good, and I think further development and further discussion would be great. So, you know, I certainly support the motion to, you know, continue further along. But let me take a few more. I have a few hands that I haven't had a chance to speak, and then I can come back and, you know, it doesn't have to be you, Mike. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but you know, anybody that wants to make that motion to have staff continue development on the alternatives provided today in the presentation, I think would be great. So I'm going to go next to Joe Cimino, and then Erica, you're up after Joe. Go ahead, Joe.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and I'm glad the regional administrator got to go ahead of me, because I agree with his feelings on this, and I'd be happy to make or second that motion on behalf of both the board and council when appropriate. I want to thank the FMAT and PDT and everyone that's worked on this, and Julia and Savannah for a great presentation. You know, I think aside from just doing that, the public is going to need some real examples when it gets out to them. And I would think that we should be focusing on one species, or have them focus on one species. It sounds like Fluke has the most information and might be able to provide the best examples. Although I think we all realize that, you know, it's been the frustrations of black sea bass and a stock that's 2.5 times its target biomass, and yet we're talking about taking cuts that I really think might want to guide FMAT and PDT to show some examples of what may have been different. So I want to put that out there. I also think that perhaps a very useful product, or maybe even byproduct of the work they do, would be to just look at fluke and sea bass and show what percent changes would mean if we just moved up 1/2 inch, down 1/2 inch, or a slight increase or decrease to the bag. Because I think if we're talking about potential 5% increments in liberalizations or stricter measures, to know what a half-inch size limit change means for regionally or for the coast is going to be important as well, and might be a lot less overwhelming than the myriad of options that would come out of fully fleshing out one of these scenarios. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So do you think, so let me ask you a question, Joe. Do you think that an alternative would be whether or not to select one species to focus on? Is that an action? Would that be an alternative to make, as a policy decision, by both the council and the board down the road, or how do you see that fleshing out? Or do you want to go to public comment with that question and then see what the public wants to do?
Well, I mean, my hope would be that this would be able to proceed for all three species. I was speaking more to fleshing out what the example scenarios would be for just a single species, so as not,
okay.
So as not to create too much work for the group, as the regional administrator said, time is of the essence here. So I wouldn't want them to have to try and explain what each of these different alternatives and each each option within the alternative means for fluke and sea bass and scup.
Yeah, right. Okay. I see your point. Yeah, I appreciate that. Anything to follow up on, Joe?
No, just that I know, our meeting time is short here, but I think it would be important, Mr. Chair, to get some public comments as well. Thanks.
Yeah, we'll definitely go to the public. We have had more hands on this topic than we've had raised in quite a long time. So I still have a few people. I'm actually going to, Erica, if you can just hold off for a second. I am going to go back to staff with the commission. Tony Kearns, I see your hand up. Did you have something you wanted to discuss based on the previous comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want clarification. So I think what Mr. Pentney and Mr. Semino are saying is that they are looking for alternate or regulations for one species in the addendum or framework document itself. And I guess I'm a little hesitant based on the steps that we would need to go through in order to get that done with the different alternatives and in time for approval of the addendum at the October meeting. I also am a little hesitant to put measures in the addendum document itself in order to get folks to focus on the concept of the alternatives themselves and have an understanding of that versus just what measures are which alternative has the best measures that is appealing to states and the public. We've had in the past where people just focus on the measures and not the actual concepts of the issue itself. And I think it's important here to think about the concept of the issue itself. And so I'm just looking for clarification on what the two speakers were looking for. I think that the PDT is going to be working behind the scenes on the alternatives for the species as the document is out for public comment, as they're building the document itself. It's just that the intention up to this point wasn't to put them in there for those reasons. And the fact that it is a lot of work to put that together and the timing would just be really difficult.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Tony. I'm just trying to wrap this all around. Yeah, there's a lot to this. Mike Pentney, I saw your hand come up. Did you have a comment to Tony's comments?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I just, Tony, I'm not sure, you may have misunderstood me, so I apologize if I wasn't clear. I wasn't proposing that we focus on one species. I wasn't even proposing that by December we have the specific measures or regulations that would apply to a particular species in 2022. I was recognizing the advice of the FMAP PDT is that they're more focused on a process, a particular model or an MSE or some other approach that would inform what the measures might be under a most liberal down to the most restrictive set of measures for a particular species. Now, you know, that process maybe could apply across all 3 species or 4 species. Maybe there would be a different slight difference to the process for each species given the nuances of the particular individual species. But that's what I was hoping we had something more concrete by October or December so that we understood what the framework, you know, adjustment actually is looking like. Ideally, maybe the council and the board would be able to select a preferred alternative for at least this part of it, the determining what bin, the factors that would determine what bin a species is in by December. That would certainly be helpful for moving forward to 2022. But I also, you know, to your point about picking the alternative that gives the best measures, to some extent, I don't think that I think those are somewhat independent. In other words, in most of the alternatives here, there is there's a range of from most restrictive to least restrictive or most liberal measures. And I think you could kind of, so if we have a process that determines, the most restrictive measures for black sea bass would be something that looked like this, and the least restrictive would be something that looked like this other thing. That might stand alone, and then what you would pick is which approach is the most straightforward or makes the most sense for how you determine what bin you're in. I don't expect that we would have a unique process and a unique set of measures for the bins for each alternative that we've been describing or discussing today. I'm not sure I'm actually getting to your point, Tony, so I'm going to stop talking and see if you can follow on if you have any more questions.
I don't have a follow-up. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll touch base with Mike after the meeting.
Yeah, sounds good, Tony. I mean, there's a lot of work to do still, and I think, honestly, I know that the timeline is to try to get something finalized by October, but this might need a little bit more development. I hate to say that to change, but we'll just see how things develop. I think we've got some really good comments today, and I still have a few hands that I want to get to before we finalize this part of the agenda. But I think there's been some really good comments and a lot of, some more development. Maybe, we'll have to talk maybe at a leadership level if I'm lucky enough to be nominated for chair for the next year. We'll have to have those discussions with leadership and figure out kind of where this stuff's going, because there's a lot of moving parts, and I'm just trying to wrap it all around my head and try to figure out where we are with it. So, Joe, I still have your hand up. I don't know, did you have something else to follow up with on?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. That
on the comments?
Was an accident, but I know Tony did kind of ask my intentions as well. And, I'm fine with this not being in the document, but I don't, or examples not being in the documents themselves. But I think it would be unfair, quite frankly, even to the board and council, let alone the general public, to not have some examples of how this plays out. As simple as the PDT and FMAT tried to make this, the intricacies are certainly there, and folks are going to need to be able to see something to understand all of this.
No, I totally agree. You're going to have some example to understand. It's like having an allocation discussion without having any tables that show what the states will receive as a you know, as an effect of decision making. It is going to be tough, and those examples are going to have to be worked through. So, you know, I think we're making good progress here. Honestly, I think we're doing both the council and the policy board have been engaged in this for quite some time. I think we're making good progress, and I'd like to see that progress continue. I'm going to go. I've got three other well, I've got a couple of other hands. I want to go to Erica Burgess next. Go ahead, Erica, if you have a question or comment.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I've got comments/questions along two different lines. So the first one is related to what Joe was talking about a little bit. The question to the board and the council were to provide feedback and guidance on the alternatives presented today. I think they did a great job laying them out in this document. I have some concerns and questions about alternative 2, and maybe depending on how the board and council feels, I don't know whether that remains in here. If we want to streamline the load for staff so that they can really focus on alternatives that might be feasible that we actually adopt in the future. My concern about question 2 is because I took what Joe was saying and wanting a concrete example. I heard staff say maybe a 5% liberalization. So if I think about bluefish, a 5% liberalization on a 3-fish bag limit doesn't really get you anywhere. We don't deal in fractions of fish. So I don't know whether these changes and measures are 5% liberalization of all recreational measures and you choose your combo of what gets you to that 5%, or maybe this percent approach may not work when you do the numbers out for the species that we're managing. The second one I thought I had was a concern about response that was given to Nicholas' question about, not having specified measures in here. My understanding of the recreational harvest control rule and the driver behind this is to provide transparency to the public, to provide predictability to the public so they can understand how the board and the council derives and arrives at recreational regulations. And I heard staff say that the measures would be chosen on an annual specification setting basis. So question for clarification is, are we choosing the percentage each time that we come to it? And if not, I don't see where choosing the percentages or the liberalization measures, what regulations you'd have for each bin, how we could do that on the annual specification timeline and then achieve our goal of being transparent and predictable to the public. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Hi, Erica. This is Savannah. I'm going to try to address your question there. So I may have misspoke when I said the annual specifications process. The intention there was to outline that there will be a specifications process for these alternatives in which the board will select measures. So the goal here is to first pick an alternative scheme and that would be used to determine what step or bin we are at. The second part of this will be to take public input and board and council approval and set measures for each of the steps and bins. Now, some alternatives do have a feedback loop in which measures can be reevaluated as we see indications that perhaps they're not working as intended, things like that. But the overall goal is to keep them in place and keep each step defined so that the public does have that clarity and that insight into what the steps would be. Now, what I meant by the specifications process is that the council and board can review each stock assessment information depending on the alternative that comes out to review trends, metrics, whatever is selected, and make sure that we are at the appropriate step and bin, and make sure that they don't need to task, say, the monitoring committee to reevaluate any measures. So it's it was a poor choice of words on my part to attribute it to the annual, but it was more of just trying to align it with what specifications process is already in place. So I hope that provides a little bit more clarity on that.
Erica, did you have a follow-up based on Savannah's response?
No, that cleared things up. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. Next, I'm going to go to Kate Wilkie, and then Ellen Bull, and you'll be up after Kate.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the FMAT and the PDT for putting in all the time and effort to put these alternatives together and all the detail into a document. So that's great. Peter Hughes asked my first question. I was a little bit concerned about, is this still frame workable? So I appreciate that came up in the discussion earlier. So I'll just move on to my second question, which is, some of these alternatives are more of a departure from how we normally set measures than some of the other alternatives. So typically we compare catch to RHLs, and then we make adjustments to measures. But I guess under some of these alternatives, we're not going to be concerned with that comparison, but rather we'll consider other sources of information when deciding if and how to adjust measures. So I'm interested in understanding more about how we will eventually check to ensure that the resulting catches are how they're comparing to ACLs. And I think there are two existing models or models that are in development to determine the impacts of bag, season, and size limits on catch. So my question is, how will those models be used in the process?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. What I'll say is that you're exactly right. I mean, I think that this the work that's been put in to developing this framework and addendum is taking a more creative look at how we manage recreational fisheries. You know, we've been doing this. We've been working on this for a couple of years now. As far as I think, you know, the direction that we're going is different from the standard, which is why we're considering it. I don't have an answer to your second question. Maybe I'll turn to staff. I don't know if Savannah or Julia, do either of you have any thoughts as to the second part of Kate's question?
Yeah, this is Julia. I'll take a first stab at it, and Savannah can add on if she thinks I missed anything important. I do think they're kind of, the two questions are related. Depending on the alternative, there's more or less of an influence of catch compared to the ACL or harvest compared to the RHL. In a lot of the alternatives, that's one of multiple factors that will be used to determine like what bin you're in, for example, or what liberalization or reduction you need. And under a lot of the alternatives, there's new considerations related to stock status that, depending on the alternative, that may be the primary driver, and catch compared to the ACL or harvest compared to the RHL may take more of a backseat, but might still be built in there for some of the alternatives. And even for the alternatives where it's not really playing an explicit role, like alternative 5 was really driven by biomass trend and stock status. Even under that alternative, we still have to flesh out like how do accountability measures relate to those alternatives, and do the accountability measures need to change? So there could still be consideration of, even with alternatives where it's not set up so that we're really aiming to prevent ACL overages to the extent that we are now. If we blow through our ACL over and over again, then that is probably going to warrant a revision. Even if that's, not explicitly part of the alternative, it could be part of the accountability measure. I don't think all of these alternatives have built in that there's a regular check-ins for stock status. So if you are having overages that are resulting in negative stock status or worsening of stock status, then there's a reaction to that. And then the question about how will the models be used in all of this, I think we still we haven't gotten to that step yet. So to some extent, we still have to figure out those details, but the models do predict catch or harvest. So we could use that to say what would be the appropriate, most liberal measures, not quite so liberal, more restrictive, et cetera. And that could be tied in, it's going to be tied, the models are predicting, based on catch or harvest. So it could still be tied into the ACL or the RHL that way, in terms of, we don't want the most liberal measures under any alternative to be so liberal that they result in catch that's so big that it would exceed the ABC and cause overfishing. Like, we need to prevent that under all alternatives, but again, like the details of the models and how we're actually going to use them to come up with the example measures is something that we're hoping to work a lot more on in the fall and can report back at a future council and board meeting.
Great. That's what I was hoping you'd say, that you'd report back, because I figured that was a pretty big question. So thanks for that, Julia.
Yeah, thanks, Julie, for that answer. And Kate, thanks for your question. I'm going to go ahead, excuse me. I've got two more hands up from council and board members. And then we're going to wrap this up. And I'm going to probably turn to Bob and Chris to determine kind of whether or not we need a motion or not. So just give that some thought, Bob and Chris, whether or not we need a motion to go forward and try to reach consensus on continuing developing the alternatives that were presented today based on the feedback and the comments that we heard. So I'm going to go next to Ellen Bolin, or before I go to Ellen, Erica, did you have something to follow up on? I see your hand's still up. Okay, your hand just went down. Let's go to Ellen Bolin, and then I'll go to Dan Farnham, and we'll wrap it up with Savannah. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Ellen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And like everybody else, really wanted to echo my thanks and kudos to Julia and Savannah and staff for taking a remarkable amount of information and putting it into an easily understood presentation and document. So many thanks to that. I think probably what I have is more of a comment, because most of my questions have been answered as we build off of this. This is, I think, as Kate has said, a bit of a departure from how we've managed recreational fisheries. And I think it's going to be pretty critical to be able to explain to the public exactly what this looks like. And I understand sort of the back and forth on presenting concepts versus, actual measures. But I think that this is a pretty high concept, and we're going to really need to be able to demonstrate to the public what it would look like. And I don't know if that's a retrospective of, if we would have done this for the past 10 years, what could have fishing looked like? I don't know what that looks like, but I think it's important to be able to provide, some level of concrete examples. And then I think the question that I have is, as we come back, and whether it's October or December, what are we really looking for from the PDT in terms of examples and or further fleshing some of these things out? So Mike, I heard you say there was a question on regionality. So in December, are we going to be looking for, when they bring out examples, what this would look like for regions? I've had people ask about, can we run this for sector separation? What does that look like? And as we begin to build those out, that obviously adds additional significantly additional requirements to staff and the team. So I think that if there's an option today to talk about some of the more complicated alternatives, Nicola talked about alternative 4, I share those concerns. Can we today, narrow down even by one what we're going to provide to the PDT on alternatives? And then I was also going to possibly recommend we make the decision to not proceed with bluefish for any any of these alternatives for the reason staff gave, which is it's hard to do this with the stock and rebuilding, and you just have less wiggle room for that. So I think my question is also, could this be done for sector separation? Because that's a question I'm getting. And really, what are we looking for from the PDT in the next 4 months? Thank you.
Yeah, those are great questions. I've made the point that as much as the timeline dictates, there's a lot here, and this has been one of the most interactive discussions that we've had as a council and as a jointly with the board in quite some time. So there are a lot of questions to be answered, and there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. I hate to rush it. My intent would not to be to rush this. It would be to, I think there was discussion earlier about possibly having some type of workshop to discuss some of these measures, which, everyone's going to be focused on the measures. That's what people are going to focus on as this develops. So, I do think that we need to have a leadership discussion about how we're going to proceed. It's hard for me to think that by October we're going to have a fully analyzed document for final decisions, but that's just my personal opinion. Staff and leadership from the different groups may have something that they want to offer that's different from that, but that's just my opinion. But Ellen, I totally appreciate your comment. I don't know, does anyone, Julia or Savannah, did you have anything? Was there anything that you thought from Ellen's comment that you wanted to provide any thought to?
Hey, Mr. Chair, I have just one small comment to that.
Go ahead.
Okay, great. We will be providing some update on the regionality question. That is something that we are considering and we'll be looking into. As for sector separation, and Julia, you can chime in as well, I do believe that's going to be a separate part of this recreational reform initiative as a whole. So I'm not sure how much we're going to be able to look into that because we don't want to set it and then have a change. But it is something that I can bring up.
Yeah, on sector separation, that's something that the FMAT and PDT has talked about and then not been totally sure how to handle because, like Savannah said, the council and policy board did decide that that's something that should be pursued through the recreational reform initiative, but after we work through this first. So to some extent, we don't really have clarity on the future intent of the council and policy board in that regard. But on the other hand, there is already some level of sector separation, like at the state level, I think for scup and then for bluefish at the coastwide level. So it's already a bit of a mixed bag. So, and then also there's data considerations with breaking the data down at that fine of level and what the models can do. So I think it's maybe potentially a bit of an open question in terms of sector separation. And I guess while I have the mic, I think the FMAT and PDT put together this timeline considering that all of the alternatives would move forward. And I personally think the biggest hurdle that we'll have is actually coming up with the example management measures, using the models that we're hoping to use to kind of put measures on paper and analyze the alternatives, and that there's going to be a lot of commonality in how we do that across all of the alternatives. So I think that's a bigger hurdle than like the number of alternatives that are in here. So I don't necessarily know that the FMAT and PDT was hoping that the number of alternatives would be greatly reduced because, again, I think the bigger challenge is how are we going to analyze the alternatives, and I think we can analyze them in a similar way. I think I think Savannah noted in the presentation that there's still also an open question of how does bluefish fit into all this because of their rebuilding plan. So that could be something that would be helpful to have clarity on today too. But yeah, I don't know that like the number of alternatives is our biggest hurdle compared to some of those other things. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Julia. I do want to start to wrap this up. We're a little bit over our time limit on our agenda. I do see a couple hands up still. I'm going to go next to Dan Farnham. If you can keep your comments as brief as possible, we'll go to Eric Reed, and then I'm going to turn to Mike Pentney, who mentioned earlier that he'd be prepared to make a motion that staff had prepared. So let's go ahead next to Dan. Go ahead, Dan.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will keep it brief. I just want to say I really appreciated the whole presentation. It's a lot to digest. I did go through the briefing materials rather thoroughly, at least I thought I did. I agree. I like the approach. I fully agree we should move forward with this to develop it and think about it more. I think I want to echo some other concerns with the ambitious schedule. I think something of this magnitude, we should take our time, make sure we do it right. I just want to go back and maybe I want to clarify too, or have clarified for me, the commercial versus recreational allocations. I know in the beginning it was stated that it would not affect the commercial allocations at all. Is that across the board in all alternatives that we're looking at here? And specifically, will it matter if the allocations are landings or catch based for each species on how these alternatives are put into place? Does it matter how the allocations are developed? Thank you.
All right,
I
thanks,
guess
Dan.
I'll take this one.
Yeah, go ahead, Savannah. Or is that Julia?
It's Julia.
Okay.
So none of the alternatives would change the allocations. They only consider how to set the bag size and season limit for the recreational fishery. So it shouldn't really have a bearing on the allocations.
All right, thanks, Julia.
Quick follow-up, Mr. Chairman, please.
Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
What about the landings versus catch-based allocations for each species? Would that make a difference in how these alternatives are being developed? Would either hinder the development of them?
Okay, yeah, sorry for not directly answering that question. I don't think so. I mean, Savannah or Garfo could maybe weigh in if they think differently, but these alternatives are all about like a general process for how you set the bag size and season limit. And like I said, under some of them, it's more focused on constraining to an ACL or RHL than others. I think and like Savannah said earlier, that they're setting a process. They're not saying like what exactly are the bag size and season limits. It's saying this is the process that you would use to decide how you get there. So if the allocation amendment results in a change to the RHL, for example, because it changes the ACL, if it's catch or landing space, if your RHL is up or down, then that would be part of the considerations that goes into what measures are appropriate at each step, but it doesn't really change like how you set up the structure of how you determine the steps. So I personally don't think it really makes a difference if the allocations are catch or landing space, but maybe other staff can chime in if I'm missing something here.
Hey, Julia, this is Savannah. I'm just going to echo and agree with what you said. This is more concerned with process, not necessarily getting into the differences between catch and landings-based allocations.
All right, thanks, Savannah. Thanks, Julia, for that. I'm going to take one last comment from my good friend Eric Reed. Go ahead, Eric.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I'll be brief. First, I really appreciate the staff and my fellow council members. This is a very refreshing way to handle a topic. But my point would be that if we're going to do examples, I would much rather have black sea bass and bluefish done as examples. They're both in two very different places right now, and I think as far as understanding what the harvest control rule can do, analyzing the top and the bottom of the spectrum is much more useful. So, thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Eric. I appreciate that, and we'll take that into consideration as we move forward. Before I go to Mike, I do want to ask the question to either Chris Moore or Bob Beal about whether or not we need a motion at this point. My notes from staff indicate that there was a draft motion prepared to move us forward. It sounds like everybody's really on board with moving forward in the direction that, with every, further development of what staff presented today. But maybe I could go quickly to Chris or Bob, if either one of you want to chime in as to how we want to handle finalizing our place here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bob, if you don't mind, I'll go first, and then Bob can jump in as well. So earlier I said that the timeline that we had was aspirational. And I think in terms of what we do today, if we want to make it more ambitious and less aspirational, then it might be a good idea to think about what Erica and Nicholas said regarding these alternatives, because I think that this whole package that was presented to us today was basically for us to have this conversation and get back to the PDT and FMAT as to which alternatives we'd actually like them to continue to work on. So if we really want to get things done sooner rather than later, it might be a good idea to drop an alternative or two from this package, which might mean that we need a motion unless everyone agrees. So I think one of the alternatives that we had to focus on earlier was alternative 4. So if everyone agreed that moving forward with the package with alternatives 1, 2, 3, and 5 would be a good idea, then I think we could do it by consensus. But if we need a motion, then we're going to be dealing with the problems related to the fact that we're meeting as a policy board and as a council, right? So we don't have this joint activity that we have associated with the species board. So it might be somewhat of a problem unless we can agree to, how that's going to work.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Chris. Bob, did you have anything you wanted to offer?
Not a whole lot to add, but thanks for the opportunity. I think, we're in a familiar spot. We're always here, right? Speed versus complexity. And we've got a number of reasons why, hearing from the regional administrator and others, why we want to be able to move right along with this document as quickly as we can, but we want to make sure it's a reasonable range of options. I think, if there's a way to pare it down a little bit and help the FMAT PDT out and keep us on the timeline, I think that's a great idea, as Dr. Moore said. So, I'd prefer to avoid a motion if we could, just because we're in this kind of strange process spot. But, if there is a way to come up with consensus, maybe what Chris said, 1, 2, 3, and 5 are great, and we move forward with that. But if, we can't get that done through consensus, then I think we'll have to go the motion route.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, from my opinion, a consensus would be great. Chris offered a suggestion based on the comments that we heard already today. I think as far as the future development of our rec measures for 2022, it would be better to have a motion on the books showing that we're making significant progress here. So I just feel like having a motion showing that both the policy board and the council are moving forward with a particular action is it kind of solidifies the overall goal that we have. I could be wrong in that. Others might disagree with me, but I just feel like that's the appropriate way forward. So I guess at this point, based on the two comments, why don't I pull up the draft motion that staff had put together. Mike Pentney offered earlier that he would want to make this motion. Mike, are you thinking that you may want to make some adjustments or make some modifications or edits to this motion? And then we'll go in after we get a motion on the board. I will go to the public. I promise. I haven't forgotten about that. We'll go to the public and get some public comment. But I would like to wrap this up in the next, 10, 15 minutes or so. We're a little bit over time. But Mike, I'll go to you and see what you think as far as making a motion here.
All right, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I'll move to approve the draft range of alternatives presented today for further development in a harvest control rule framework addendum. So as written, the staff motion.
Okay.
If I may, I guess if I get and I can make that for the council and the board.
Okay.
And then if I get a second, I will maybe follow on with some thoughts.
Yeah, let's see if we get a second. I think Joe Cimino, didn't you say earlier that you would be willing to second this motion on behalf of the council and the board?
That's correct, Mr. Chair.
Okay. All right. So we have a motion on behalf of the council, Regional Administrator Pentney and Joe Cimino on behalf of the policy board, both Pentney and Cimino as well. So this is, just to be clear, this does not reflect the comment made by Dr. Moore just a minute ago about maybe reducing the amount of alternatives within the document. So let's go ahead. Mike, go ahead, Mike. If you want to offer some comments here, that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. And, I recognize Chris's comment about potentially streamlining this a bit. But I also note that I think staff was asked that question directly, and their response at least indicated to me that removing one of the 5 alternatives wouldn't really streamline the analysis so much, because they can conduct the analysis kind of equally for all the alternatives. So I think in the interest of having a wide range of alternatives from kind of somewhat simple to more complex, I think the current range really fits the bill there and allows us to think about different approaches. Alternative 4 does appear more complex on the surface, but one potential benefit of alternative 4, because there are more boxes, more bins, the changes moving down or up a bin wouldn't have to be so great, versus some of the alternatives that are much more straightforward to understand and apply. But because there's fewer bins, the differences in the measures among those bins would necessarily need to be more substantial, and so there might be some benefit to continuing to consider alternative 4 as well. But in the interest of maybe streamlining this a bit and simplifying it, and I'm not prepared to include this in my motion, because I'd like to see the main motion stay as is. But certainly, if someone was willing to or interested in removing bluefish from this action, so that the range of alternatives would only apply to summer flounder, scup, and sea bass, a motion to amend my motion to exclude bluefish, I could see supporting that in the interest of simplifying the analysis and the further development somewhat. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thanks, Mike, for those comments. Joe, did you have anything you wanted to offer before I go to the rest of the group?
Yes, I appreciate the chance. I support the motion as is. I agree. If the FMAP PDT come to us at the next chance we get and say one of these options is too complicated, please remove it, then that's fine. But for now, I'd like to continue to see this. And I don't necessarily have so much of a concern with bluefish, although I do think it should be off the table right now in the context of we continue to go forward saying this doesn't apply to any stock. in rebuilding. So not that this couldn't be used for bluefish in a few years once the stock is rebuilt. So I would just like to kind of keep that clear that the reasoning is that any stock that's in a rebuilding plan would be out of the mix. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a good point too. Yeah, I appreciate that, Joe. Okay, so let's see. I've got Savannah. Did you have something you wanted to offer here? I see your hand up, and then I'm going to go to Adam Nowalski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that it was clarified about the public comment discussion that we had earlier. I was going to chime in towards the end of our discussion. So I've just left my hand up for that if you think it's appropriate now, or I can wait.
Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead.
All right, so I just wanted to clear up some of the back and forth that we did have earlier about the public input during this process. One of the ways that we're envisioning this working is that the work groups that we would have that were listed on the slide would be more for feedback and an interactive opportunity with the public and with stakeholders to better understand measures that they would like to see in place. If based on some of the feedback from the council and board, we might consider adding some other public workshops to help with the alternatives, but the main idea there was to solicit stakeholder input on different management scenarios to try to understand what kind of management measures the public wants to see based on different scenarios under some of these alternatives. The public comment portion, which is part of the traditional addendum process with the commission, would be exactly the same. We would have states or regional public hearings for the public to provide feedback and comments on the different alternatives presented. So I hope that kind of clears it up. We're not just going to have, two, very small opportunities for public comment. We want to make sure that we're getting constructive public comment and that the public does have an opportunity to interact. So I hope that kind of clarifies that a bit going into continuing this process.
Yeah, thanks, Savannah, for those comments and thoughts. I wouldn't expect anything different. I think that both the council and the board or the commission are fully invested in making sure that the decisions we make are transparent to the public and provide an opportunity for the public to present their comments and thoughts to the managers around the table. So I appreciate that, Savannah. Thank you. I'm going to go to Adam Nowalski next, and then I'm going to go to the public on the motion before us. And then after that, we'll go ahead and call the question. Go ahead, Adam.
Thank you. So I had asked the question earlier about moving this from the policy board back to the species board. I think the conversation about 2022 overtook that. So I'm not sure I got clarity. But again, after hearing the regional administrator's comments about taking out bluefish, I think I want to come back to that and what is staff's recommended way forward, if that is the desire here at this point, to amend this motion to remove bluefish, which would be a de facto move, I assume, of this topic to the species board, but maybe it wouldn't do that. I'm not saying that any of this work wouldn't consider bluefish as they're working through it. I trust the FMAT and PDT, some whose members focus on bluefish specifically, have great knowledge of it, not that they wouldn't have an eye to it. So if we modified this motion to remove bluefish, would that be a de facto move back to the species board, or would a way to accomplish moving this back to the species board let this motion go and then have a follow-up policy board motion only that would move this back to the species board?
Yeah, that's a great question, Adam. Something I was thinking about as well. Honestly, I mean, I'll go to Bob in just a second, but I would think that since the policy board decided they wanted to be the lead board on this recreational harvest control rule, that the policy board would have to direct the species board at at a meeting, I guess maybe the October meeting. That's if we decided to pull bluefish out of this. The reason why we brought the policy board in the first place was because of bluefish and summer flounder, black sea bass, scup, and we thought that maybe 3 boards was going to be too much. Let me go to Executive Director Mr. Beal to see if he has any thoughts as to how this might play out. If we leave it like it is, Bob, can you tell us what the next steps would be, or if there's an amendment to modify this direction, which it was against both makers of the motion to modify it to remove bluefish at this time. But can you give us a scenario as to how that would work?
Thanks, Mike. I'll give it a shot. Yeah, I wasn't really excited about motions in the first place, and I'm less excited about amendments and substitutes and everything else, just given the lack of process that we have. But I think if bluefish was removed, the policy board, as you stated, Mr. Chair, it would need to make that decision to take themselves out of the rec reform project and refer that back to the Summer Flounder, Scup, and Black Sea Bass Management Board. And I think the part that I'm unclear about is there's been some different sort of interpretations of what removing bluefish might mean. In other words, is there no consideration of bluefish at all in this document anymore moving forward? Or is it stating that the harvest control rule does not apply to overfished stocks or stocks in a rebuilding program? And however, once bluefish is out of the rebuilding program, then these provisions automatically begin to apply to bluefish. And if that's what happens, where these provisions apply to bluefish at a later date, then the states that are represented on the bluefish board would still need to be involved, because it is a potential future impact on how the bluefish fishery is managed. If it really is removing it, saying, no more analysis, bluefish is not considered, this harvest control rule, rec reform initiative, all now solely focuses on summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass, then I think the policy board would have an easier time referring that back to the Summer Flounder, Scup, Black Sea Bass Management Board. So happy to answer questions, but I hope that helped.
Yeah, no, it definitely, I'm thinking along the lines that you are. If there's language in the addendum and framework that addresses a stock that's under rebuilding, then like you said, once that stock is rebuilt, it could fall into this framework addendum, which would mean that the policy board would probably want to maintain connectivity with this action. Yeah, we don't have very well defined rules regarding the way that this is not a joint action per se. So I would like to keep from complicating things too much. We can always make changes down the road as we get updates and new information from the PDT and the FMAT. So, but I like your thought though, Bob, and I'm kind of reading into what you said, but perhaps we leave this motion as is and put some comment in there. If that, and we'll have an opportunity to review it in a draft document regarding stocks under rebuilding plans. So, Bob, did you have anything you wanted to follow up? I still see your hand up.
Sorry, forgot to put it down.
That's okay. Mike Penny, go ahead, Mike.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, this is why I didn't include excluding bluefish in my motion, because I wasn't sure what the general tenor of the room would be on it, but I was willing to to consider it. But I've heard a couple of people say, well, this process wouldn't apply to stocks in a rebuilding program, and I guess I don't understand why that would be the case. To me, they should apply, and I think it's maybe inherent in the system that we ultimately adopt to account for that. So, I note, for example, that the fishery score proposal, the first row is a fishery score of 0 to 1.99, which is the highest risk level of concern of very poor stock status and the most restrictive measures. So to me, that would, that row would likely apply to a stock and a rebuilding program. Another alternative, the biomass-based approach, explicitly has a row, steps E and F apply to a stock that's overfished. I also recognize the reference point model, does have a row for B less than B threshold and simply refers to the rebuilding plan. But that's why we have a range of alternatives, different ways to look at stock status, and then based on that stock status, tell us what set of measures would apply. And so I don't think a priori we should say that none of these alternatives would apply to a stock and a rebuilding plan, because some of the alternatives explicitly account for a stock and a rebuilding plan and prescribe what bin would be appropriate. So, I hope we can, again, accept that this is a concept for indicating what bin we should be in based on stock status, and there's different ways to look at that. And then, as we've talked about, focus on the process that we would use to identify the measures that would be appropriate for those various bins. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Yeah, I see where you're going with that, and I certainly appreciate the thoughts there. So let's do this. Are there any other comments from the board, from the policy board, or the council at this time before I go to the public? I do want to offer the public an opportunity to weigh in on where we're going with this harvest control rule. Okay, seeing no hands from the policy board or the council, I'm going to go to Greg DiDomenico. Go ahead, Greg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just on behalf of Lund's Fisheries, I'm going to decline to make a comment or oppose or support the motion, simply because not having the ability to have some very essential questions answered about this entire process, I really can't. I don't have an opinion on the motion. I would just add that until we are comfortable with whether or not this will control the RHL or the recreational fishing effort, and whether or not the what this does to the efficacy of actual allocation numbers and the allocation amendment, until I have an answer to those questions or feel comfortable with the outcome of this, I can't make any comments on the motion. So thank you for the opportunity, but no comment on the motion. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Greg. And I feel I kind of see where you're coming from. I think there's some work still to do to be able to actually make comment on as this develops. I'm fully supportive. I've been fully supportive of continuing down this path and developing this framework addendum, and I know the council and the policy board have as well. But until it shapes up a little bit more, I can understand your thoughts about making comment to the specifics. But I appreciate your time spending your time here with us this morning. I'm going to go next to Mike Wayne. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mike Wayne with the American Sport Fishing Association. I appreciate the opportunity to provide comments supportive of the motion. As a group that's been working to try to find solutions here, I commend the PDT and the FMAT for the range of alternatives that they developed. I'll echo the sentiments of the regional administrator, and I'm excited for the next phase of this. I know there's a lot of questions, and I think it's important to get stakeholder input at this point. The range of alternatives is there. I think if you put situational examples using these alternatives in front of the recreational community, it will help them choose the best solution. So I'll echo some of the comments that were made there. And we'll be looking forward to the public process that rolls out as the next steps here. I appreciate the time to provide input on this.
All right, thanks, Mike. I appreciate that. Is there anyone else from the public that would like to provide comment? If you can raise your hand, or if you're on the telephone only and you might not have the ability to raise your hand, go ahead and speak up at this point. Okay, hearing no one and seeing no hands, I'm going to bring it back to the board and the council. I have Shanna Madsen. Go ahead, Shanna.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So actually, I guess I'd be commenting as a member of the public today because I am not our policy board representative, but I just wanted to take a chance as being, serving on the Black Sea Bass Scup Summer Flounder board and on the Bluefish board to make a couple of comments. First of all, I wanted to comment on some of the conversation regarding removing bluefish from this harvest control rule framework. I might be mischaracterizing what I think that I'm hearing from a few people. I don't think anyone was saying, like, let's remove this completely from the framework. I think people are saying, let's not change horses in the middle of the stream. So essentially, if we're in the middle of a rebuilding plan already with bluefish, let's not switch that rebuilding plan to look like whatever this new framework ends up looking like. At least that's kind of how I was interpreting what some of the comments were. I also really just wanted to reiterate that I think that staff and the PDT and FMAT have done a really excellent job with this framework and this memo. One thing I was thinking of as I was reading through it is I was wondering if maybe some sort of chart maybe could be developed, which kind of compared and contrasted the different metrics that go into each alternative. I think that would sort of get to what the differences are between the alternatives and maybe kind of help steer us in one direction or another. But those are just a couple of things that I was thinking about. Thanks for letting me comment.
No, I appreciate that, Shanna. And yeah, I know you're a newly appointed member of the Summer Flounder Scup Black Sea Bass Board, and I'm sorry, when I see your name, I assume that you're speaking for Virginia in your policy role with the different boards that you serve on. So, but thanks for your comments. I appreciate that very much. Does anyone else have anything they want to offer before I call the question on this motion? I think we've had a very robust and very detailed discussion regarding the work that's been done. I want to just go on record to applaud the PDT and the FMAT for the work that's been put into this. I feel like we're making solid progress, and we'll look forward to updates, as we go forward, maybe in October or in December, at the next chance we get to meet jointly with the policy board. So that said, and seeing no hands, I'm going to go ahead. I guess Bob and Chris, I mean, I think what we'll do without making it too complicated, we'll see what the council and policy board decide. It seems like most people are supportive of moving this forward, so I don't think we're going to have a problem here. But I just want to put it on your notice, Chris and Bob, that we probably have to get leadership together to talk about how this moves forward in the future, as far as voting and motions and things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and read the motion into the record and then call the question to the council. And then, Bob, I'll turn it over to you since Pat's not with us, to call the question of the policy board. So the motion is to approve the draft range of alternatives presented today for further development in a harvest control rule framework / addendum. Is there anyone on the council is there any opposition from the council? on this? You can raise your hand if there's opposition. Okay, I see no opposition as far as hands raised. Any abstentions? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and call this on behalf of the council. The motion passes by consent with no abstention. And I'm going to go ahead, Bob, and turn it over to you to call the question of the policy board. And
Great, thank you.
I don't believe that my policy board, as far as Maryland goes, I don't think that Bill Anderson is on this call. So I'll be representing Maryland for the policy board.
Excellent. Thanks, Mike.
Okay.
Is there, I guess, any need to caucus before we take the vote? Raise your hand and we'll give a minute or two. All right, seeing no hands, we'll go with the same approach the council took. Is there any opposition to the motion that Mike Luisi read into the record? Seeing no hands, are there any abstentions? No hands there either. So looks like the motion passes the policy board by consent with no abstentions. I'll turn it back to you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Okay, so I think it was a really, I'm sorry we went a little bit long on the agenda, but I think it was well worth it to have that discussion. Let me ask Savannah and Julia, or Tony and Bob and Chris, is there anything else that we need to take up at this point before we take a quick break, before we jump into the next agenda item?
Not for me, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Savannah and Julia, is there anything else we need to do right now?
Nope, I think we're good.
Okay.
Yep, we're good to go.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both very much for your presentation, and thank you to everyone who participated in the discussion. I really appreciate it. It shows how important this issue is, and you know, where we're going to go in the future on these issues. So let's go ahead and take a break. It is 11:42. Why don't we come back at 11? We'll go maybe 10 minutes, 11:50-ish, and we'll start. We're gonna actually, so I'll adjourn the meeting of the policy board with the council, and we're gonna come back in a joint meeting with the summer flounder, black sea bass, and scup board. And for those of you who have gotten online, I apologize for, you know, the running a little bit long. And so we'll be back in 10 minutes. Let's go 11:50. 11:50. Yeah, 11:50 is fine. Give us 7 minutes to stretch our legs a little bit and get right back into the ecosystem approach to fisheries management on the summer flounder management strategy evaluation. So take a quick break and we'll be back. Thanks.